Her landlady threw her into the streets, and she walked straight back into the world of the Korean Mafia boss who hadn't said her name in 5 years. The landlady didn't give her a week, didn't give her a day, just 45 minutes and a garbage bag for whatever didn't fit in a suitcase. Alicia Myers packed the way a woman packs when life has trained her for loss. Fast, quiet, choosing only what matters. Clothes, documents, the photo of her mother. And at the very bottom, a man's shirt she still slept in, folded so no one but her would ever know. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She carried her 2 bags down 4 flights of stairs, stepped into the rain, and stood there. She walked for 2 hours, past shelters she refused to enter, past payphones she refused to use, past every sensible option a woman with no money and no family should have taken. Her feet carried her east, then north, then into a neighborhood she swore she'd never return to. She slid into a booth at a cafe on 7th Street, ordered a coffee she couldn't afford, wrapped her hands around the mug, and breathed. But 3 blocks away, in an office she couldn't see, a man who hadn't spoken her name in 5 years was about to hear it again. The landlady's name was Mrs. Brennan, and she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her mouth set in the thin line of a woman who had already made her decision, 2 months behind. That was what she said. 2 months behind, and she wasn't running a charity, and she wanted the apartment cleared by noon. It was 11:15. Alicia didn't argue. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing with someone who's already decided costs you time you don't have and dignity you can't afford to lose. So she nodded. Closed the door gently. Not because she wasn't angry, but because slamming it would have meant she still believed the apartment was hers. And stood in the center of the room and did the math on what fit in 2 bags. Clothes first, the ones that still had life in them. She folded each piece the way her mother used to fold laundry. Tight, precise, every crease deliberate, like order was the last thing you gave up when everything else was already gone. Documents next. Birth certificate. The ID she'd renewed twice at different addresses. Pay stubs from the care home she kept, not because she needed them, but because they were proof she'd been somewhere. The photo of her mother went into the side pocket, face down, wrapped in a sock so the glass wouldn't crack. The shirt was last. She pulled it from under her pillow where it had lived for 5 years. Faded, soft, washed so many times the collar had gone shapeless. It didn't smell like him anymore. It hadn't in years. But she folded it and placed it at the bottom of the bag beneath everything else. No one would see it there. No one needed to. 41 minutes. She was early. She carried both bags down 4 flights of stairs. Back straight, jaw set. Mrs. Brennan was in the lobby pretending to check the mail, and Alicia walked past her without a word because the woman wanted a reaction, and Alicia had decided a long time ago that the things people wanted from her pain were things she would never give. The rain had thinned to a mist. She stood on the sidewalk, not lost, not frozen, just recalculating. Shelters were south. She didn't go south. Payphones were on every other block. She didn't stop. A woman at the bus stop looked at her 2 bags and opened her mouth to say something, and Alicia smiled. The kind of smile that closes a door while looking like it's opening one. And kept walking. East first, then north. Past the intersection where the bodega used to be, past the laundromat that had turned into a nail salon, past the park where the benches faced west and the sunset used to turn the whole street golden. She wasn't choosing this direction. Her legs were. Her body was navigating from a map her mind had tried to burn 5 years ago and failed. The cafe on 7th Street looked the same. Same awning. Same window booth with the cracked vinyl seat. She pushed through the door and the bell above it rang the way it always had, and the sound hit her somewhere below the ribs where she kept the things she wouldn't look at. She sat in the booth, ordered a coffee, wrapped her hands around the mug and held on. She didn't know that 3 blocks east, in a building with no sign on the door, a man was sitting in a room full of men who feared him. She didn't know that one of those men had seen her walk past the park with 2 bags and a face that gave nothing away and had picked up a phone. She didn't know that the name she hadn't said in 5 years was about to be spoken in a room where no one had dared say it since the day she disappeared. She just knew the coffee was warm. The booth was the same. And her body had carried her to the only place that ever felt like it wanted her to stay. Shin Min-ho ran an empire the way other men breathed. without thinking about it, without asking permission, without stopping. His name opened doors that didn't have handles and closed ones that didn't have locks. Men twice his age lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Men half his size left the country when they heard he was looking for them. He had built something precise and vast and merciless, and he sat at the center of it the way a man sits at the center of a wound. Still, controlled, and absolutely certain that movement would make it worse. No one called him by his first name. No one touched him without invitation. No one stayed in a room longer than he wanted them there. His world operated on discipline. Not the kind that was taught, but the kind that was built brick by brick. In the years after he woke up one morning and reached across the bed and found the sheets cold and the closet half empty, and the air still holding her perfume like the apartment hadn't realized she was gone yet. He didn't panic that morning. That was the thing people wouldn't have believed if they'd known. He stood in front of the open closet and looked at the gaps between his shirts where her dresses used to hang, and he didn't call anyone. Didn't shout. Didn't break anything. He just stood there and felt something leave his chest that he knew. Even then, even before the searching and the silence and the 5 years that followed, was never coming back. He searched for 3 months. Quietly. Methodically. And the way he did everything, with resources most men didn't have, and a patience that looked calm from the outside and was something closer to desperation underneath. Every lead went cold. Every thread broke. She had disappeared the way only someone who wanted to disappear could. Completely, cleanly, without a single trail left behind for a man with every reason and every resource to follow it. He stopped on a Wednesday. Not because he'd exhausted every option, because he was sitting in his office at 2 a.m. with a file on his desk that contained every address she'd ever lived at and every name she'd ever used, and he realized that a woman who leaves like that, no note, no call, no explanation, has already told you everything she needed to say. The leaving was the answer. And in asking her to come back would mean asking her to take it back, and that was the one thing Shin Min-ho's pride could not survive. Not the rejection. The begging. He closed the file. He put it in the bottom drawer. He never opened it again. The name went next. Not by order. He never told his men not to say it. He didn't have to. The first time someone mentioned her, 3 weeks after he stopped searching, a lieutenant who didn't know better referencing the apartment she'd lived in. Min-ho looked at him. Just looked. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling through the vents. The lieutenant never finished his sentence. No one in that room ever said her name again. 5 years. 5 years of silence so complete it became architecture. A structure built around an absence. He filled the space with work. With expansion, with the kind of growth that looks like ambition but is really just a man building rooms so he never has to sit still in the one that's empty. Then Park Jun-seo, young, reliable, too new to know the history, stepped into his office on a Tuesday evening and said the words that took the architecture apart. "Sir, a woman, cafe on 7th Street, 2 bags, she matches—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Min-ho's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Not a flinch, not a tremor. A slow, deliberate grip, like a man holding the edge of something to keep from falling. The room, 4 men, all of whom had been with him long enough to know what that silence meant, went still. He didn't speak for 11 seconds. Every man counted. "Alicia." He said it quietly. Not to anyone. Not as a command. Not just the name. Released into a room that hadn't heard it in 5 years. Spoken by the only man who had the right to say it and the only man it could still destroy. The room heard it. The room understood what it cost him. And 3 blocks west, in a booth on 7th Street, the woman whose name had just been spoken for the first time in 5 years, wrapped her hands tighter around a coffee mug and had no idea that the man she left had just said the only word he'd sworn he'd never say again. The man came to the cafe 40 minutes after she'd ordered her second coffee. He was young, clean-cut, wearing a dark jacket that fit too well to be off the rack. He stood at the edge of her booth the way men in Min-ho's world always stood. Polite, precise, waiting to be acknowledged before they spoke. Alicia looked at him and knew. Not because she recognized him, because she recognized what he was. The posture, the deference, The way he held himself like a man who answered to someone who didn't tolerate carelessness. 5 years hadn't changed the uniform. He placed a key on the table. Silver, new, attached to a plain ring with no label. Beside it, he set a folded piece of paper with an address written in handwriting she didn't recognize. A building on Lexington, 3rd floor. It's furnished. There's no lease. No timeline. He didn't say Minho's name. He didn't need to. Alicia looked at the key the way a woman looks at a door she knows she shouldn't open. Not with fear, but with the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent 5 years walking in one direction and can feel the ground pulling her back. She slid the key across the table toward him. No. The man paused. He wasn't used to the word. He picked up the key, nodded once, and left without argument. The bell above the door rang behind him, and then it was just Alicia and her coffee and the piece of paper he'd left on the table because she'd pushed back the key but hadn't touched the address. She slept in the cafe that night. The owner, a man with gray temples and kind eyes who'd been running the place since before she first found it, let her stay in the back booth after closing. He didn't ask questions. He locked the front door and left the heat on and said goodnight like she was a guest and not a woman with nowhere else to go. The second night, she slept on a bench in the park 3 blocks west. She folded her jacket under her head and kept her bags between her feet and didn't sleep so much as hover in the shallow space between consciousness and collapse. A man walked past at 2 in the morning and looked at her, and she looked back with eyes that said, "Try it," and he kept walking. The 3rd day, it rained. Not the thin mist from the day she arrived, but a heavy, deliberate rain that soaked through her jacket in minutes and didn't stop. It rained through the afternoon and into the evening, and by 9 o'clock she was standing under the awning of a closed hardware store with her bags at her feet and the piece of paper, damp, soft at the creases, still in her coat pocket. She went to the building on Lexington at 10:15 that night. The key worked. The apartment was small, clean, and warm in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had made sure the heat was on before she arrived. She locked the door behind her, set her bags on the floor, and stood in the center of the room without turning on the lights. Just breathing. Just letting the rain sound different from the inside. She unpacked the way she always unpacked. Shirt last, placed under the pillow without looking at it, pressed flat so she could feel it against her palm when she lay down but never have to see it. She found it the next morning. She almost missed it. The kitchen window faced east, and the light came through in a way that caught the small wooden shelf mounted beside the stove. It held 3 books. 2 were worn paperbacks, titles she didn't recognize. The 3rd was a copy of a novel she had read 6 years ago in a different apartment, in a different life, curled against a man who had laughed at her for reading the same book twice. It was not a common book. It was not the kind of thing a landlord leaves in a furnished apartment for a stranger. It was the kind of thing a man remembers because a woman once fell asleep reading it on his chest. Alicia stood in the kitchen with the book in her hands and understood that Minho had not just given her an apartment. He had chosen this one, prepared it, placed something in it that only she would recognize and only he would know to leave. His presence was in the walls before he ever walked through the door. And she stood there holding the proof of it and didn't know whether the feeling in her chest was gratitude or grief, or the thing she'd spent 5 years refusing to name. Alicia learned the building the way she learned every place she'd ever lived, by finding out who needed something. Mr. Yoon on the 2nd floor was 73 with a bad hip and a daughter in Connecticut who called on the first Sunday of every month and forgot the other 3. He ate the same meal every night, rice, soup from a can, whatever fruit was on sale. And when Alicia knocked on his door the 4th morning with a plate of japchae she'd made from memory and ingredients she'd bought with money she didn't have, he looked at her like she'd handed him something far more expensive than noodles. Danielle on the 4th floor had 2 kids, a boy of 6 who never stopped moving and a girl of 4 who never started, and a shift at the hospital that ran from 7 to 7 and sometimes 7 to 11 when they were short-staffed, which was always. Alicia told her she'd watch the kids on the long nights. Danielle opened her mouth to say she couldn't ask that, and Alicia said you didn't, and that was the end of the negotiation. By the end of the 1st week, she knew every tenant by name. By the end of the 2nd, she knew their schedules, their groceries, their particular loneliness. The woman on the 5th floor who played piano in the evenings and stopped abruptly at 9 like someone had told her once that she was too loud and she'd never forgotten it. The couple on the first floor who fought in whispers and made up in silence and left for work in the morning without looking at each other. Alicia moved through the building like water filling cracks. She cooked, she carried, she listened. She showed up at doors with food or time or the specific kind of attention that says, "I see you," without requiring anyone to say it back. It was the thing she was best at. The thing she'd been doing since she was 12 years old and her mother came home from a double shift too tired to eat, and Alicia learned to make dinner from whatever was in the cabinet and leave it on the counter without being asked. It was also the thing that kept her alive. Not physically, internally. Every hour spent carrying Mr. Yoon's groceries up the stairs, or helping Danielle's son with his reading, or sitting with the woman on the 5th floor while she played piano, was an hour she didn't spend in her own apartment with the book on the kitchen shelf and the shirt under the pillow and the silence that tasted like a name she wouldn't say. She was filling her days the way she'd filled the last 5 years, with other people's needs, stacked so tightly there was no room for her own to breathe. It almost worked. It had always almost worked. Then Mr. Yoon mentioned him. They were sitting at his kitchen table. Alicia had made doenjang jjigae because he'd mentioned missing his wife's cooking and she'd looked up the recipe at the library. And he was talking the way old men talk when someone finally sits long enough to listen. About the building. About the neighborhood. About the man who owned the building and how he'd come himself last winter when the heating broke on the 2nd floor and missed her. Yoon had expected a maintenance worker and instead got a young man in a dark coat who sat on his kitchen floor for 40 minutes, fixing the radiator with his own hands, and didn't say much but left the apartment warmer than it had been in months. "He's not what people think," Mr. Yoon said. He said it simply. The way you say something you believe because you've seen the evidence. Alicia didn't ask his name. She didn't need to. She held her tea with both hands and smiled the way she smiled when she needed the conversation to move forward without her falling apart inside it. That night, she lay in bed with her hand on the pillow. She could feel the shirt underneath. Shapeless, soft, holding nothing but the memory of a man she'd convinced herself she knew. A man who sat on a 73-year-old's kitchen floor and fixed his radiator in the cold. She didn't sleep. She lay there with her palm flat against the pillow and tried to reconcile the man she'd left with the man Mr. Yoon described and couldn't. And the thing she'd spent 5 years refusing to name moved in her chest like something waking up in a room she thought she'd locked. He told himself it was the building. The electrical panel on the 1st floor had been flagged in a report 3 weeks ago and he hadn't sent anyone to look at it, and that was the reason. The only reason. He was walking through the front door on a Thursday afternoon in a coat he didn't need and shoes that were too clean for a building inspection. He heard her voice before he saw her. Coming from the 2nd floor landing, warm, unhurried, saying something about the weight of the bags and how Mr. Yoon needed to stop buying watermelons because she was the one carrying them up the stairs. And then a laugh. Low and real, and exactly the same as it had been 5 years ago when she used to stand in his kitchen and tease him about the way he organized the refrigerator like a man preparing for an audit. He stopped on the stairs. His hand found the railing. Not for balance. For anchoring. She came around the corner with 2 grocery bags in her arms, and Mr. Yoon shuffling behind her with his cane in one hand and a single bag of rice he'd insisted on carrying himself. She was mid-sentence. Something about the fruit vendor on the corner overcharging again. And then she looked up and the sentence died in her mouth, and the 5 years between them collapsed into nothing. She looked the same. That was the first thing that hit him, and the thing he would never admit to anyone. She looked the same. Older in the places that mattered. The steadiness of her gaze, and the way she held herself like a woman who had learned to carry things alone. But the face was the same face that used to fall asleep on his chest with a book folded open on her stomach, and he had to stop looking at it before his discipline cracked in a hallway where it couldn't afford to. Neither of them spoke. Mr. Yoon looked between them the way old men look at weather they can feel changing, and thanked Alicia for the groceries and shuffled into his apartment and closed the door gently behind him. The hallway contracted. The ceiling felt lower. The light from the window at the end of the corridor turned the space amber and quiet and impossibly small. Min-ho spoke first. Because someone had to, and because he had spent 5 years being the man who speaks first and controls what comes after. The apartment. Is it adequate? Not a question. A sentence shaped like one but delivered flat, the way a man delivers words when he's using them to hold something larger in place. Alicia recognized it. She had always been able to hear the thing underneath the thing he said. "It's fine," she said. "Thank you." A pause. She watched his jaw shift. The smallest movement, a recalibration, like a man adjusting his grip on something heavy. "You're helping the tenants." He said it the way someone notes a fact they didn't ask for. Then, quieter, with an edge that came from somewhere deeper than the hallway. "You always did find people to take care of." It landed. Not like a slap. Like a knife laid flat against the skin. Not cutting, but letting you know it could. The words carried 5 years of silence behind them. And 5 years of a man who woke up to an empty closet and never got an explanation, and had been carrying the weight of that silence in his chest like a stone he refused to put down. Alicia took it. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. She held his gaze the way a woman holds something she knows she deserves and said, "It's good to see you, Minho." His name in her mouth. He hadn't heard her say it in 5 years. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, uncontrolled, immediately buried. He straightened. The coat shifted on his shoulders. The mask came back. "The electrical panel on the first floor needs attention," he said. "I'll send someone." He turned. He walked down the stairs. He didn't look back. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Both of them felt every second. And the hallway held the shape of them standing 3 feet apart long after they were gone. The amber light, the quiet, the unbearable geometry of 2 people who used to share a bed standing on opposite sides of a distance that had nothing to do with feet. The electrical panel took 3 days. The hallway light on the 4th floor took 2. The window latch in the lobby that had been sticking since before Alicia moved in took an afternoon. Minho came for every one of them. Not to fix them. He had men for that. But to check on the work, which required walking through the building, which required passing through the hallways where she always seemed to be. He never announced himself. He just appeared. In the stairwell, in the lobby, rounding a corner with his hands in his coat pockets and his face arranged into the expression of a man attending to property and nothing else. But he came 3 times in the first week, then 4 times the next. And every time, Alicia was there. In the hallway with Mr. Yoon. On the 4th floor landing with Danielle's son on her hip. I'm in the lobby holding the door for the couple on the 1st floor who still wouldn't look at each other. They talked. Carefully. The way 2 people talk when the real conversation is the one happening underneath. In the pauses, in the things they don't say, in the specific selection of words chosen because the honest ones are too dangerous. He asked about the building. She answered. He mentioned a repair. She nodded. Ordinary sentences, municipal. But every 3rd or 4th exchange, the sharpness from the hallway surfaced. A comment from Minho delivered with precision, aimed at the place where her kindness met her disappearance. "You remember everyone's name in this building," he said one afternoon, watching her label containers of food for Mr. Yoon's refrigerator. "You always had a talent for making people feel known." A pause. "And for leaving without telling them why." She took it. She always took it. Her hands didn't stop moving. Her face didn't change. But something behind her eyes absorbed the blow the way a wall absorbs a fist. Holding, not breaking yet. He came on a Tuesday evening and found Mr. Yoon's door open and Alicia inside, standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like sesame and garlic. Mr. Yoon was sitting at the kitchen table telling her a story about his wife, and Alicia was laughing, not performing, not deflecting, really laughing. And Minho stood in the doorway and watched her. His face did something his discipline couldn't control. It softened, not all at once, not dramatically. Just the jaw loosening, just the line between his brows releasing for a fraction of a second, just the eyes staying on her a beat too long. And the face of a man remembering what his kitchen used to sound like when she was in it. He caught himself, straightened, walked away before she turned around. But she heard him. Not his face. His voice. 3 nights later, she was in her apartment, and his voice came through the wall, low and measured, speaking to someone in the hallway. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. Her hands went still over the sink. The water ran. She stood there and listened to the cadence of him, the rhythm she used to fall asleep to, and didn't move until the hallway went quiet. The stairwell door was the thing that broke it open. A Thursday. Late. She was coming up from the lobby. He was coming down from the fourth floor. They reached the door at the same time and both reached for the handle and their fingers touched, index finger to knuckle. The half-second of contact. And both pulled back like the touch had carried 5 years of current through it. They stood there, the door between them, the stairwell humming with the sound of old pipes and nothing else. Min-ho looked at her, then down, then at the door. He opened it and held it for her, and as she passed through, close enough that she could smell his cologne, different from 5 years ago but worn the same way, he said something, quiet, low, almost to himself. "You still cook for everyone but yourself." She heard it. She kept walking. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked her apartment and closed the door and pressed her back against it and stood there in the dark with her eyes closed and her hands shaking. The warmth and the wound were fighting each other in every hallway, every stairwell, saw every accidental meeting that neither of them would admit wasn't accidental. Neither was winning. Neither could afford to lose. The knock came on a Sunday evening. 2 knocks. Measured. Patient. The knock of a woman who knew the door would open because it always had. Alicia opened it and felt the hallway shrink. Yuna looked exactly the way she remembered. Composed, immaculate, every strand of hair in place like disorder was something that happened to other people. She stood in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin level and her eyes holding the same steady calm that had walked into Alicia's apartment 5 years ago and rearranged her entire life in under 20 minutes. "May I come in?" Alicia stepped aside. Not because she wanted to, because her body still responded to Yuna's certainty the way it had at 23. Automatically, obediently, the way you move for someone who sounds like they know something you don't. Yuna sat at the kitchen table. She didn't look at the book on the shelf. She didn't scan the apartment for evidence of Min-ho's involvement. She either already knew or didn't need to confirm what she'd come to address. "You're back in his orbit," she said. Not accusatory, factual. The same tone, the same measured delivery. "You left for a reason, Alicia. The reason hasn't changed." Alicia stood by the counter. She didn't sit. She didn't cross her arms. She just listened the way she had listened 5 years ago. Still absorbing, letting the words land without interruption. "You are still the thing that puts him at risk. His enemies haven't disappeared. His world hasn't softened. And a woman with no protection living in a building he owns, in a neighborhood his men control. Ida's exactly the kind of vulnerability that gets exploited." Yuna paused. "Let the weight settle. I'm not telling you to leave again. I'm telling you to remember why you left in the first place." The same words, the same architecture. Concern built around a conclusion that was already made before the conversation started. 5 years ago, Alicia had sat on the edge of a bed and felt every sentence land like a stone on a scale that was already tipping. She had believed Yuna. Not because the argument was perfect, but because Alicia already believed the worst thing about herself and Yuna had simply given it a shape. But Alicia was 28 now. And 28 had buried a life and built another one and lost that too, and walked through rain with 2 bags and slept on a bench and stood in hallways with a man whose hurt came out as sharpness because the softness underneath it had nowhere safe to go. 28 had carried things that 23 couldn't even name. So when Yuna said his name, Min-ho, spoken carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to you, Alicia saw it. The tightness around her mouth. Not concern. Tension. The specific tension of a woman who has practiced saying a man's name casually and still can't stop her jaw from setting around it. And when Yuna talked about protecting him, her eyes shifted. Left, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second. The way eyes move when the mouth is saying one thing and the chest is holding another. And Alicia saw a woman in love with the same man. Not a lieutenant delivering intelligence. Not a protector issuing a warning. A woman who had watched the man she loved become softer for someone else and had decided, 5 years ago on a Tuesday night, to remove the someone else. Not with a threat. With a truth close enough to the real one that a 23-year-old girl who already believed she was poison couldn't tell the difference. Alicia didn't say any of this. She nodded. She thanked Yuna for coming. She walked her to the door and closed it gently and stood in the kitchen alone. Then she sat at the table where Yuna had sat and put her hands flat on the surface and replayed every word from 5 years ago. The same words. The same voice. The same calm certainty. But she heard them differently now. She heard them the way a woman hears something when she finally knows who's speaking. Not what they're saying, but why they're saying it. The foundation didn't shatter. Foundations that old don't shatter. They crack. Slowly. Along lines that were always there but never visible until the light hits them from a different angle. Alicia sat in the kitchen and felt 5 years of belief begin to fracture and didn't move for a very long time. She waited for him in the hallway. Not his office. Not the room where his men stood and watched and reported. The hallway on the 3rd floor where the light from the window turned everything amber in the late afternoon, and the building was quiet enough to hear the pipes settling in the walls. He came at 4. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. Measured, deliberate. The walk of a man who had never once entered a room without knowing exactly how he would leave it. He rounded the corner and saw her standing outside her door and stopped. "Alicia, I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to let me finish before you speak." He didn't sit. He didn't lean. He stood 3 feet away with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her face, and waited the way a man waits when he can feel the weight of what's coming and has already decided to stand under it. She told him about Yuna. The Tuesday night 5 years ago. The knock on the door when he was away. The woman who sat in her apartment with her hands folded and her voice steady and told her things that sounded like truth because they were built on the scaffolding of things Alicia already believed about herself. She told him what Yuna said, that his enemies were watching, that a woman with no protection was a target, that loving Alicia was the one vulnerability his empire couldn't survive. That if she stayed, she wouldn't be the one who suffered. He would. She told him she believed it. Not because Yuna was convincing. Not because Alicia had been waiting her entire life for someone to confirm what she already knew. That she was the common thread. That her father left because of something she was. That her mother worked herself hollow because Alicia wasn't enough to make staying easy. That every good thing she touched eventually broke, and the kindest thing she could do for the man she loved was leave before she broke him too. She told him she packed at 4 in the morning. That she took his shirt. That she didn't look back because looking back would have shattered the only resolve she had. Minho didn't move. His jaw tightened, not once but in stages, like a man absorbing blows he refuses to show. His hands went still at his sides. Not clenched, just still. The stillness of a man holding everything in place because if one thing moves, the rest will follow. When she finished, the silence filled the hallway like something physical. It pressed against the walls. It sat between them like a third person. 5 years of it, dense and heavy and full of everything that could have been said and wasn't. Then he spoke, quietly, not looking at her but at the wall behind her. The way a man looks at something far away when the thing in front of him is too close to survive. "I couldn't say your name." His voice was low, controlled, but the control was costing him, and she could hear it. "For 5 years, I reached across the bed every morning for 3 months before my body learned you weren't there. I built this." He stopped, reset. "I built everything, every room, every deal, every year, and none of it fit in the space you left." He looked at her then, not with sharpness, and not with the blade he'd been carrying in every hallway conversation for weeks, with the thing underneath it, raw, unarmored, the face of a man who had just discovered that the worst 5 years of his life were built on a lie told by someone standing beside him. "You left because you loved me," he said. "Yes. And I stopped looking because I thought you didn't." The sentence sat between them. Neither reached for it. Neither could. Alicia slid down the wall. Not dramatically. Not collapsing. Just a woman whose legs had been holding her upright for 5 years and had finally, quietly, decided to stop. Minho looked at her on the floor. Then he sat down across from her, back against the opposite wall, knees almost touching. the hallway barely wide enough for the two of them and the truth between them. Neither said, "I love you," when they didn't need to. It was in the silence. The first silence they'd shared in 5 years that wasn't made of absence. It was made of presence. Of two people sitting on the floor of a hallway finally understanding that they'd been grieving the same loss from opposite sides of a lie. The light moved across the floor. Neither of them got up. Minho found Yuna in the office where she always was. 3 steps behind his chair, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. She had perfected the distance over 8 years. She had made a life out of it. He closed the door. The men outside heard the lock turn, and none of them looked at each other because the sound of that lock meant something private was about to happen in a world where privacy was a weapon. "You went to her," he said. "5 years ago, the night I was in Busan." Yuna didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and the composure she had worn like armor for 8 years held for exactly 3 seconds before something behind her eyes shifted, and she understood that the conversation she had been dreading for 5 years had finally arrived. "And yes, you told her she was a liability, that loving her would get me killed, that leaving was the only way to protect me." "Yes?" Minho didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He stood on the other side of the room and looked at the woman who had been beside him longer than anyone and spoke with the precision of a man who had spent the night on a hallway floor with the truth and had come to deliver it the same way it had been delivered to him. Without mercy, without softness, without anything to cushion the landing. "You didn't protect me, Yuna. You decided for me. You looked at the woman I loved and told her she was poison, and she believed you because she was 23 years old and already believed it about herself. And I lost 5 years, not to enemies, not to risk, to you." Yuna's composure cracked, not dramatically. A breath that came in uneven, a swallow that took too long. The smallest fracture in a surface she had maintained for 8 years, because maintaining it was the only way she knew how to survive being in love with a man who had never once looked at her the way he looked at someone else. "I loved you," she said, quietly, not as a defense. As a fact, the way you say something you've carried for so long it's worn smooth and has no edges left. "I know," Minho said. "And the night you sent her away was the night you lost me. Not to Alicia, to what you did. You chose to stand next to me over being honest with me, and it gave you neither." Yuna didn't argue. She knew. She had known for 5 years. Every morning she walked into this office and stood 3 steps behind his chair and watched him carry a wound she had made and told herself it was worth it because at least she was still here. But being here had cost her everything that being here was supposed to mean. Minho opened the door. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't fire her. He just opened the door and the conversation was over, and what happened next was something Yuna would have to decide for herself. Alicia went to the cafe on 7th Street. The same booth. The same cracked vinyl. She ordered a coffee and wrapped her hands around the mug the way she had the night she came back. 2 bags at her feet, rain still drying on her jacket, a woman with nowhere to go. She didn't call Minho. She didn't send a message. She just sat. Because for 5 years she had run. From him. From love. From the belief that staying would destroy the people she cared about. And the bravest thing she could do now, the thing that terrified her more than sleeping on benches, and more than losing apartments, and more than every cold night she'd survived alone, was to stop, stay in one place, and let him decide. The bell above the door rang. She looked up. Minho stood in the doorway. He saw her. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and sat down across from her the way 2 people sit when they've been standing for 5 years and are finally tired enough to rest. She said his name first, not carefully, not like a wound, like a woman done whispering it into a faded shirt at 3 in the morning and ready to say it to his face. "Minho." He looked at her. The sharpness was gone. The anger was gone. What was left was the man she fell asleep reading on, the man who argued about groceries, the man who searched for 3 months and stopped because his pride told him to and spent 5 years regretting that he listened. "Alicia," he said, slowly, Like the word had been locked in a room for 5 years and he was finally opening the door. No penthouse, no empire, no grand gesture. Just two people in a cafe, saying each other's names like they meant it. Like they always meant it. Like 5 years of silence was just a held breath. And they were finally exhaling. If this story touched your heart, if you felt every silence, every crack, every breath Alicia and Minho fought through, then don't let this be the end. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to believe in love again. And subscribe for more stories of people who fight the world and win. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling with me. This is the Soul Shadow.